Today, Michael will be talking about why story always comes first. And then part two, well, you'll have to tune in and catch that in order to find out what it's all about. But I want to give a thanks to our sponsors of the event, Outex. So thank you.
Great. Well, again, my name is Mike Snyder. I'm a photographer. I'm a filmmaker. I'm based in Charlottesville, Virginia. And as Scott mentioned, this is the first part of a two-part series. So today's session is called Why Story Always Comes First. And we're going to be exploring why being a great photographer also necessarily means being a great storyteller. And I've been asked here not to reveal what next week's session is going to be, but I'll just give you a clue. It's going to be a lot more about gear and some top tips for shooting in the field. But that's all I'll say. So that's the plan for the next two sessions. I'm going to start just a little bit by introducing myself and showing you some of my work, which will explain what I do and why I do it. And then we'll get into some of the content. And again, before doing that, I also want to say a huge thanks to our sponsor for the series, Outex. Outex are really great guys to work with, and they make some truly excellent gear, which I frequently use in the field. I have for years, and I'm going to be showing you some of that in our next session. So we're going to flip over now to some slides. And get going. Great. Okay, again, my name is Mike Snyder, or Michael O. Snyder is what I publish underneath. You can find out more about my work at Instagram at Michael O. Snyder, and michaelosnyder.com is my website if you want to check out my work. And Outex you can find at RealOutex or outex.com. So let's begin by showing you just a little bit of my work to give you a sense of what I do and where I come from. And I'll start here by telling you a little bit about my story. So I grew up in a small town in rural Appalachia on a piece of land that was both incredibly beautiful, but it also had been disfigured by 100 years of industrial extraction. And so at a very young age, I became passionate about environmental issues, which is what I studied at both the undergraduate and the graduate level. And it was during my grad program that I came to two realizations that led me to the work that I do today. And the first is that climate change and broader environmental issues, I believe that they are the call of our generation, simply because those issues stand to make every other issue that we care about a lot worse. And secondly, we already have a lot of the policy and the science and the technology that we need to solve a lot of these issues. And simply, we're not doing enough with it. And I found that really, really shocking. And so we've got to get a lot better at shifting individual attitudes and public action around combating environmental issues. And it turns out that visual storytelling, photography, film, and so on, has an enormous potential here, particularly when that storytelling is yoked to science on one end and impact partners on the other. And I'm going to say more about that in this lecture. And so 10 years ago, I started a documentary production company called Interdependent Pictures, and I became a full-time photojournalist, and I work on stories about environmental and social issues. And I look at both the causes and the solutions, and I often partner with nonprofit organizations to do that work. So I've worked all over the world. I've been lucky enough to publish in outlets such as National Geographic, the Washington Post, the Guardian, and so on. And so I'm really passionate about what I do. I feel very privileged to be doing that work, and I'm really glad to be here with you today. And I'll just flip through a few more photos here, and we will get going. Great. Okay, so I want to tell you one more story here about how I got here, and then we really will jump in. And it's a story about my work, my first time I worked with National Geographic and what I learned from that. So I was a photographer full-time starting in 2010, 2011, and then 2017, I got my first big break, and I got to work on a National Geographic Young Explorer grant about sea level rise. And at the end of that project, they brought me out to speak on the National Geographic stage at Mountain Film in Telluride, Colorado. That's the photo in the bottom here. And afterwards, there was a big party. And all of the folks from the National Geographic cohort was there. And I was super, super excited because there were some really big names in the room. And what I assumed was going to happen is I was going to go around the room and I was going to find out a lot about, one, technique. How do these guys do the amazing things that they do? And secondly, about editors. Who could I meet, network with to publish my work? And certainly those things did come up in conversation. But it's the other half of the conversation that is the realization, the big realization I had that night, and it's going to be what built on all of the information I'm going to be sharing with you today. And the realization is that having the right gear and being able to make the great images is only half of the battle. Now, it's a critical half. There's no doubt. You've got to have the right gear. You got to know what you're doing with it. But the rarefied and critical skills are these ones. And some of this I'm going to share with you today. So let's name them first. The first one is an ability to find and name your personal why. Why do you do what you do? Why do you care about these issues? If you're going to work on a social issue or environmental issue, why you? How did you come to this? The second is the ability to find and build access to great stories, right? We're not just talking about pretty pictures here. We're talking about the stories that are underneath them. So what is a great story? How do you find it? How do you build access to it? Okay, number three, we want to have the ability to access great funding. The funding landscape isn't what it used to be. So how do we find funding to be able to do our work? And number 4 and 5, I'm going to put together, and that's the ability to create and maintain meaningful relationships with publishers, production partners, and other folks that work in this industry. This is a very, very tight-knit community, and the ability to build relationship is critical. Okay, so our journey today, what we're going to talk about is we're going to start talking about a topic. How do we find great topics to tell these stories? 2, how do we transition from topic to story? 3, how do we build access to those stories? And finally, because we're talking about environmental and social issues, how do we build impact around our work? And the plan here is to talk to you for about 45 minutes and then flip it over to questions at the end. So if you've got any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat and we'll get to them at the end. Okay, so part 1, choosing a topic to work on. This is the easiest one to be able to get to. Now, this is a super busy slide, and this is a long list of possible social or environmental topics we'd be working on. Of course, this is by no means comprehensive. You could add to this list forever, right? So the point here isn't to list all the things you could possibly work on. The point is to think very carefully about the topics that you work on, and the critical bit is finding your personal why. So pick a topic and ask yourself, why do you care about this issue? Is it personal to you? Have you been impacted in some sort of way by it? Do you have personal knowledge about this issue or professional knowledge? Maybe you study this issue. And just as critically, can you actually access this issue? You might have a topic you want to work on, but maybe it's on the other side of the planet, right? Or maybe you don't know anybody that works in that space, right? So an ability to get access to the story is critical. So think very carefully about it. And the goal here, no matter what you choose, the goal of photojournalism in general is to make the invisible visible. That's what we do with our cameras. And to contribute in a novel and compelling way towards the conversation around this issue, novel being new, so hopefully you're not repeating what's been done, right? And hopefully drive action around this. That's what we want to do as an end result. Okay, so the topic is the easy part. Now we get into the real meat of the question. We picked our topic. How do we move on to story? What is a story? So I want to just take a moment here and say a word about why we should tell stories. So the photo on the left here is a picture of the Cuyahoga River on fire in 1969 in an article that was in Time magazine. And this article sparked a national outrage. The reason that it was on fire is that it was so incredibly polluted. And so they had a photographer and a journalist that came out and took photographs of it. It ran in a feature piece. And not long after, there was a lot of pressure for environmental regulation. But here's the part of the story that most people don't know. From 1838 to 1952, that same river had caught on fire 13 times, right? So this wasn't the first rodeo for the Cuyahoga River. So what was different in 1969? And the answer is visual storytelling. Somebody was there to be able to take this photo, to put it in front of people all around the country and all around the world. And it was that was a critical piece of making the difference. Okay. Second over here, we have the famous Earthrise photo, 1968. Fun fact, this is actually turned 90 degrees clockwise from what the astronauts would have seen. But this is another great example, right? We've known, some humans have known anyway, that we are a ball in space since 500 BCE. But somehow when we took this photo and we were able to all over the world be able to see ourselves, actually see ourselves as a tiny little balls floating among a black abyss, that changed fundamentally the way that we think about ourselves. And the reason why it changed is the story that we tell ourselves of who we are, right? And so following not very long after both of these photographs, we get in 1970, 72, 73, 74, a series of environmental legislation that fundamentally changed the way we work in this country. And that went on to seed other things around the world, right? But the visual storytelling component came before that. And many have argued it's a critical part of making change. So you have a lot of power as a photographer or as a filmmaker. Okay, we could spend another semester talking about what is a great story, how does story work, and breaking apart key aspects of storytelling. But if we have 2 minutes in which to do it, 3 minutes in which to do it, which is how much I'm going to put into this slide, these are the things that I would break down to say are the 8 core elements of great photo stories. So I want to walk you through them. projects that I work on, this is how I think about them. These are the questions I ask myself. And often when I present a project to a photo editor, these are the questions they're going to ask me. So feel free to screen capture this or think about this. If you have any questions, we can come back to it at the end. So I'm going to run through these pretty quickly. Okay, first, have a hook or an angle. So ask yourself, what's surprising about this story? What expectation does this challenge in the viewer's mind? That's the number one thing I hear for editors. Surprise me, show me something new. Like, we've seen these stories over and over again. So how are you going to tell this story in a way that's a little bit different? Have a hook, have an angle. Okay, number two, great stories are told with great characters, right? So you may have chosen your topic, but who's your character that's going to be living through this topic, right? And great characters have something that they're after, something they're doing, something that they want, that they're seeking for. And by going through that, they're going to change, right? So telling a story is fundamentally about watching characters go through something hard that transforms them and they learn something about themselves. And these characters, they don't have to be supremely likable or hateable. You know, great characters are neither perfectly good nor perfectly evil. A lot of times they're broken, beautiful people, just like we all are. So ask yourself, what's broken about this character? And also what's beautiful about them? And the goal here, again, we'll look to the left here, to the blue text, is to tell the big, that's the big picture, the big story, to the experience of the little, right? So we're just taking maybe one character and asking ourselves, let's say they live with pollution on the Cuyahoga River, their experience of that. Through their experience, we're going to learn about the big picture. Okay, number 3 and 4, conflict. If there's no conflict, there is no story. So ask yourself, what is the conflict? What's the conflict that I'm after here? And that could be in the form of external conflict, something in the outside world that's external to the character, that's preventing them from getting what they want. But it also could be an internal conflict, something that's conflicted inside of them, something that gets after those flaws that we were talking about, right? So we can explore both those things. And often the internal landscape in our characters is just as interesting as the external landscape. And indeed, usually it's both, right? So the conflict in a story is the spark that starts our story off, right? No conflict, no spark that moves our characters into action. And that spark will move them towards a strong opinion, which will move them to action. Ultimately, that action will put them in a vulnerable space, which will lead to transformation and hopefully eventually to wisdom. The point of telling stories is that result in something that we learn about ourselves by the characters learning something about themselves. So conflict is the spark that starts that all off. Okay, number 5, agency and action. This is really, really important, particularly for visual storytellers. What are our characters doing about this issue, right? We want to show them doing. Great photojournalism stories are about doing, so show us doing. Stakes. The question is, why should your audience care, right? Make them care. Show them what the stakes are in this situation. And by asking yourself the question, what will happen if this character does or does not get what they want? What are they really after? What does it mean to me? Okay, and finally, careful about your topic and your theme. Your topic we've already talked about. That's the thing that's happening on the outside. But your theme, that's what this is really about. That's what's happening on the inside of your character, right? So maybe that's about redemption, or maybe it's about self-sacrifice, or maybe it's about letting go, or maybe it's about struggle. Whatever it's about, think really careful about the universal human theme, because that's what's going to communicate at the end of the day. Okay, and finally, number 8, do your images communicate this? And that's critical too. Thinking about your images, do they actually stack up to these things I want to show? Does each of my images in my story do the work of this kind of storytelling? So we have to think really careful, because we only have maybe 24 frames to tell this whole story. Okay, so think really carefully about your story and how you're putting it together as you shoot it. And I want to say a really important point here, and that is there isn't just one way to be able to do this work. I'll give you an example here. I'm working on stories about sea level rise and how it's impacting Americans across the coast. One project I have is called Eroding Edges, and that's taking this sort of narrative documentary storytelling approach, much like what I was just telling you about. So the way I'm thinking about that project is through the 8 elements I just shared with you. But there are other ways to tell stories. And I have another project called The Coming Coast, which just takes a conceptual approach. And in this case, I'm using blue tape to paint into communities where sea level rise may be in sometime in the next 80 years, right? So it's another way to get after the sort of the hidden impacts of sea level rise. And I'm also having characters hold a depth stick, as you can see, to show where sea level rise will be. Not as much driven around story, they're not necessarily doing anything about it, but potentially another powerful way to be able to get after things. So you can take a narrative storytelling approach, or you can take more of a conceptual or even a fine art approach, and both of these can be really powerful ways to do your work. Okay, to summarize, you want to be able to put yourself in the middle of this circle when you pick what story you work on, right? What do I care about? What do I know about? What do I have personal connections and access to? What is novel or builds off previous work? What's timely and important? And what works visually and narratively is compelling? Okay, great. So you have identified your topic, you started to narrow in your story. Now I want to talk a little bit about finding that great story and building access to it, right? And we're going to say what access is. We're going to explain that because that's a really, really critical piece of the equation here. So here's an important truism in storytelling. Your project is only as good as your story for the reasons we've just talked about, but your story is only as good as your access. So in other words, it all rests on access. And access means the ability to be able to tell that story, to get to the characters, to see inside of their lives, right? To be able to really understand and be in a position where you can shoot this story and be able to write about this story too, if you're writing about it. So let's look at the red line here for us about finding stories. So here's some places where you might find great stories to work on. And indeed, I found a lot of the stories that I work on on all of these items here on the list. So you might look at your life and say, what do I have interesting that's going on? There may indeed be things that you're doing and you're living that actually other people will be really interested in hearing about. So you can look at your life or your family, your friends, and your community. And oftentimes when I get together with my family, friends, and community, I canvass them for stories. I'd say, tell me what's going on, what's new, what's really interesting, anything neat happened recently? This can actually be an amazing resource. And I would say half of the stories that I work on and the characters that I know have come from these conversations. And every time I do hear an idea, I write it down, I circle back to it, I look at it over time, and some of these bubble up to become stories that I work on and I publish. Okay, then you can look at news, magazines, radio, TV. A lot of times there's stories that are worked on that do get published in some way, but there's so much more to the story that could be done, right? There's another aspect to this, particularly if you hear it on radio or on a news short. So maybe you can circle back and work on that in a deeper way. I work with a lot of nonprofit organizations, universities, researchers, and I ask them the same thing. You're doing really interesting work. Tell me about some characters that are really living in that work that you're doing, right? So I keep really close contacts with them. And finally, you can go and look what other photographers have published. You can look at sites that the list goes on here, but SDN or Lens Culture, that social documentary network, are really great places to go and look and see what other people have done. And that might spark an idea in you in terms of a project you can work on. Okay, so that's finding a story. Now let's talk about the harder bit here. Let's say you've got your story, you want to work on it. How do you build access to that story? Well, there's two kinds of access, right? The first is first-person access, and that means it's your story to tell. So easy enough. You know where to go. You know the people to ask. It's your experience, your family. But let's say you've got a story. You're like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. I can't believe this is happening. I really want to work on this. This is perfect. I'm completely fascinated, but it's not my story to tell, right? This is called third-person access. So how do we build third-person access? And then we're going to ask ourselves the question next, how do we do that ethically? But let's look first about building third-person access. And I'll say the number one way in, the key way in to be able to building access to these stories is to have a foundational knowledge of that issue. And that's why this goes back to choosing your topic carefully. Choose your topic with your why in mind. Because if you have a why, if you're personally connected to this, it means something to you, you know something about it, you have critical knowledge, and that's going to help get you in with your characters that you want to work with, right? So you're leveraging that knowledge to make connections and meet gatekeepers. Now, gatekeepers are individuals in the community that you want to work with that have connections. They're trusted individuals. So if you want to be able to get to know a community that's impacted by an issue, you're going to need to get to know those gatekeepers first. And gatekeepers for every project differ quite a bit. A lot of times when I work in remote communities, it might be a faith leader, or it might be a nonprofit that works in that community. It could be a trusted community leader, like a political leader. It could be any number of individuals. And I go to them first, right? And then once I'm trusted with them, I might be able then to spend time in the community. It takes time though, right? And that's the problem with these long-term projects is that they take time to be able to get going because you need to be able to build that trust to tell it properly. Okay, you may be able to help build trust and build access by giving something back. That's what reciprocity means. So you can do that sometimes directly. You can license your images back to the organizations or communities that you're working with. I do that quite a bit. I'm very comfortable doing that. I offer prints to the folks that are in the communities. And sometimes I offer training or pro bono work to the folks that I work with as a way to be able to give back. And then, of course, you can do that by showing you care about their work. That's an indirect way to work on that too. And finally, like I said, time. This just takes time to get to know people on a personal level, but it's how these projects are built. And absent that, it's really difficult to do the work well. You can always tell when you look at a really great photo project if it has great access. And it's also hard to do it ethically. So I just want to give you three examples of projects of mine and talk a little bit about how I build access. And then we're going to talk about some of the ethics here. So super quickly from left to right, left is my sea level rise project. Again, I studied environmental issues at the graduate level, so I have direct personal knowledge of this issue. Climate change is my specialty, and that's my way into the conversation. I'm working with community leaders all around the US. And a lot of times I work with a nonprofit that I know because I have good connections in the nonprofit space because again, that's my field, it's my background. And then I work with faith leaders a lot. And I lead in with the questions about faith and what that calls us to do about environmental issues. And as I said, I always give back. So I give back to these communities in the form of either prints or licenses, or again, trying to get training for the folks in these communities. Okay, the project in the middle is about queer identities in Appalachia. Specifically, I'm working with drag queens. I've been working on this project for about 10 years. I just got a Pulitzer grant to be able to continue work on this. And the critical piece here is time. So I'm from Appalachia, as I said. I do know the community well, but I'm not a person with a queer identity. And so for me to be able to tell this story, I felt like I needed to take the time to get to know folks. So I spent years just going to the drag events. After that, I started having conversations. I got to know the community leaders. And in building that trust and understanding the stories in time, finally, 7 years after the fact, 6 years after the fact, I started to feel like I could actually work on this project because I understood it in some kind of way. Okay, so it takes time. And of course, again, I'm giving back prints. I want to bring back a show of work to Appalachia. It's really important to me that we do that. And finally, I have a project called Into the Dark. This was featured in National Geographic 2 years ago just now. And again, I have climate science as my background. This is a climate science project. So I was able to know it that way. I know researchers that work in the field. This was a relatively easy one for me to build access to. Okay, so just some examples there of how we build access to our work and our stories. Okay, let's just say a word here. This is really important about the ethics behind this. And this is something that's come up. I think it's a needed conversation that we've had in photojournalism in the last 10 years, especially. It's an old conversation, but it's come up in a new way. And that's the difference between building access that is extractive and building access that truly is empowering. And I won't spend a lot of time on this slide, but I just want to go through some of the highlights here. If you're doing your work in an extractive way, it means that you're building access really quickly. And the only reason you're building access is so you can get what you want and get out, right? The relationships are fundamentally to get the photos you need, get the story you need, and get out of there. It's not for the relationship itself. The voice of your work is principally your voice, your thoughts as the outsider, or maybe the editor's thoughts, and it's not that of the community. Most of the benefit is not for the community itself. There's no direct return of benefits or indirect returns. And finally, the audience is usually for global or very remote audiences. All right, so if you're working on environmental issues and it's some remote place and you do it this way, this would be called extractive media, right? And there's a lot of negative impacts to this, which we don't have time to go into here. Hopefully some of that is self-evident to you. But the other way to build access, and the right way to build access, is to do it that's a way that's empowering. And that's taking the time to build relationships that are started in advance and are maintained after the story is published. So really you're interested in them and what they want to do. The voices that you elevate are not only your own, you shouldn't discard your voice entirely, but it's also the voice of the community that you're working with. When you think about benefits, you see quite a bit coming back to the community. Again, that could be in prints or shows that come back. You can license images to the nonprofits who are impact partners working around this issue. You can help to pursue grants that would support what the community needs, like the funding for training or provide cameras or training for the community so they can tell their own stories. You might look for grants that allow community members to travel, to speak at events. You can get really creative here in terms of how you bring back benefits. And you can indeed ask them, what would benefit look like to you in this situation? And finally, your audience is not only an international audience, a global audience. That's great. That's great. We really want to bring these issues to as many people as possible, but they're also for the people that the stories are about. Right? And so I think very, very carefully, how can I bring these stories back to the communities? How can I gallery at a high, hopefully a high level, beautiful photos in the community that they were made for? I usually invite impacted people to come and speak at those shows and see themselves in that light and hopefully feel empowered by the work and feel a part of the work. Okay, difference here between extraction or empowerment when it comes to access building. Okay, great. And let's talk a little bit about impact. Again, the reason why we're doing this work, for me anyway, my driver, my why is I care about these issues. I care about social issues. I care about environmental issues. So when I do my work, I want to ask myself, is this just pretty pictures or is it more than that? So I think very carefully about driving impact around my work. And we're going to look at some ways that you can do that. Okay, so I want to point out to you 4 hallmarks of projects that end up making a difference, right? If we sit back and we look at impact as a metric and we try to measure that, what do highly impactful projects have in common? And we're going to talk a little bit about the message that they have, the kind of collaborations they use, the tone that they take, and the scale that they operate at. And when I say make a difference, you can make a difference with your work in a lot of different ways. And you may do all of these, you may do some of these, but here are different ways that your photography can make a difference. You can expand to new audiences. You can reach people that have never been reached before with your work. That's a great way to do it. We know with environmental and social issues, we've got to get out of the choir. We've got to reach more people. How do we get strategic about reaching new audiences? Of course, we want to raise awareness about these issues. Hopefully more people know about them. But fundamentally, we want to look at the next two, and that's changing systems and structures that lead to these issues and changing individual behaviors as well. And it's both, right? We want individual behavior change, but we also critically want systemic and structural change. And we'll mention those when we get to collaboration, because the only way to do that is to do that in collaboration with folks that do that work. And finally, building communities that are resilient and can move this work themselves down the road. Okay, so those are some ways you can make a difference. Now the question is, how do we make a difference? And we're going to look at these and think about ways we can blend these into our projects and our storytelling. Okay, let's talk about message first. And the thing that I want to press upon you is when you think about what's the message of your work, I want you to think about 4 kinds of knowledge, right? And I'll break these down and explain what I'm talking about here. There's what knowledge, why knowledge, how knowledge, and where knowledge. Okay, let's start with the what. This is the easy one. What exactly is the problem, right? So we think about climate change. We could describe what the problem is in, geophysical terms. We could describe it in socioeconomic terms. But we're essentially describing the problem. And I would call this a high school level of knowledge about the issue. And we want to be able to do this. We really want people, that we think about climate change, we really want them to have a firm foundational grasp on exactly what the problem is. But we move on to number 2, why knowledge, and I will call this collegiate level knowledge. This is a critical sense of the idea, and ask questions like this. Well, how did we get here? Why do we have this problem in the first place? What are the underlying social, economic, political, historical, and so on, things that have led to this problem existing? So hopefully your work is doing both of these things. And even if you're a photographer, I do recommend you think about this in the way that a writer would think about this, and also try to get after these things, because your photos should be showing this as well, right? So it's not all right to sit behind the camera and be, this is my job, this is all I do is take pictures. Really try to think critically about the story yourself, so that you know what pictures to take that can be used along with the writing, or perhaps you're even writing yourself. Okay, so these 2 kinds of knowledge I think most folks know about. Now the last 2 are less well known, and the research tells us that if we want to drive impact around our work, these are really, really, really central, and they often get left out. So how knowledge and where knowledge. Let's take a quick look. How knowledge asks the question, how do we solve this problem, right? How are people solving this now? And we need to show those solutions. And how do they find the courage and hope to be able to do that work, right? So this is critical, because if we don't do this, right, then essentially what we're saying in the form of environmental problems and social problems, that our characters are just victims, right? And we know when people see that, right, and they don't have any hope for the future because there's nothing that's being done, the audience tends to retract and move back from the issue. So we've got to be able to show that there is hope. There are people that are working on these issues. There may well indeed be solutions in the future. And more often than not, with a lot of problems, there are solutions. So we can do this, but we've got to take the step to being solutions focused. Okay, and finally, where knowledge. This is the hardest to sort of describe or put a finger on, but it's sort of a visionary idea. It's a very hopeful idea. Where do we want to go? Like, we don't just want to build ourselves away from a problem. That's the solutions. What's the better story? What's the bigger future? Right? What's the hopeful new paradigm that's not only going to solve this problem, but hopefully build a more sustainable, more just and fulfilling world, right? So we want to be able to ask our characters that, and hopefully show them, enacting those visions, the bigger picture. I touched on this, some of this, but I just want to kind of reiterate this here. Why is doing all 4 kinds of knowledge so important? Well, the research tells us that, only if we can see that there's hopes and solutions, that it's going to actually lead to change people's minds and lead them into action, right? Absent of that, we're just describing the problem. It might be intellectual curiosity at most, but they don't actually take the next steps to either adopting solutions themselves or voting for them. So we have to show solutions. Number 2, it elevates those that are carrying on the work. And there are people that are doing this work, and it's their life's work, either because they're directly impacted or they care about it, and it gives them energy to be able to carry on. So we're supporting them. And finally, there are communities all over the world that are being impacted by similar solutions. If we show solutions, it seeds those in those groups that are looking for answers. So lots of reasons to do this. Okay, and then our other three. First, collaboration, and I'm going to show you a case study of collaboration here in a minute, just to wrap out the session. But the critical bit here is if you want to drive impact, you cannot do it alone, right? A photographer on their own cannot do it. That's hubris, or to think that the photos themselves are the change is absurd, right? So you need to think about relationships, and I build relationships with funders, distributors, industry partners, nonprofits, educators, advocates. For the first 5 years of my work, I spent very little time doing that. But in the last 5, 6, 7 years, I've spent a lot of time doing that. And those relationships have been essential, not only to making me a better photographer, right? But to also driving impact around the work. So these are really, really critical. And I'm going to give you, again, a case study to show you one example of how I've done that. Number 3 is the tone of our work. And the idea here is if we want to drive impact around social environmental issues, we've got to create bigger circles. Oftentimes the circles that we're talking in are too small, and we're mostly talking inside of the circle, right? We're not really convincing folks on the outside, but we know that we need a critical mass of people that agree with these issues in society to be able to make meaningful, durable change. So if our tone is othering, in other words, us versus them, there's the enemy over there, we're not really ever going to get there. So we've got to think about how we build a bigger tent, but at the same time, not giving up our truth. So not capitulating to injustice. And hopefully this kind of reverberates with people that work in this space. We need to think very, very carefully about our tone. It's not an easy question to ask ourselves. So we want to have this balance between confronting the power that causes this issue to arrive, but also honoring the humanity of both the people that are impacted as well as folks on the other side. Really, really difficult, but important to do. And finally, on scale, we certainly want to talk about and be focused in solidarity with communities that are being impacted, individuals that are being impacted, but we also want to scale all the way up on our projects and advocate for the structural change that causes that in the first place. And we talked about that a little bit. We talked about the kinds of knowledge that underlie these issues. Okay, so think about how your question, how your story exists within scale, all the way down from directly at the impact to all the way up to where this impact came from. Okay, just a little bit of time here, but I want to give you a quick case study on a collaboration that I built around a recent project. And this is a project I was showing you before. I didn't say much about it because I know we would come back to it here. And this is the lead image from it, which was published in National Geographic in March of 2020 on their digital side. And this is a story about a group of scientists during the polar night. That's the months of the year in winter where the sun doesn't rise. That were researching how thinning sea ice is allowing more light to get into the environment because there's less ice on the ocean, and how that's impacting marine organisms. And what I want to show you here is that first, with any project that you can create, you can build not only a photo project, but an ecosystem of media around it. So in a lot of projects that I do, and this would be a good example of one, certainly I did a photo essay around it, but I also did a number of these other things. I built a documentary film, we built an explainer video in partnership with a number of other content creators, we built audio stories, educational tools. And so for all of the projects I work on, I think about them in this way. Once I have the story, once I have the access and a little bit of funding and some partners, how can I shop this story out to a lot of different spaces? And the reason I do that is all of these different tools reach different audiences and tell stories in slightly different ways, right? And they'll, of course, they'll magnify back to each other by bringing in more opportunities for funding and connections, which you can then leverage to be able to tell a better story. It's a much bigger story that reaches more people. Right. So the first thing here is thinking about ecosystems of media. Can you tell all these different kinds of stories? Or if not, can you partner with people that can? And I usually do one or the other. Okay. And then secondly, I wanted to show you for all the projects that I work on, I make a spreadsheet. Right. And I think about all these different areas of collaboration that I want to be able to fill in the blanks on: funders, distributors, industry, nonprofit, educational advocacy, art and gallery, and so on. And for this project, I wanted to show you and just tell you a little bit about some of the individuals that organizations, I should say, that came onto this work and how you can maybe do this in the projects that you run. So let's start here with funders on the left-hand side. So again, I found out about this story through a friend of mine who was working on this issue, writing about this issue. And again, I had known folks in this space because I studied climate science. And so we went to the University of Tromsø, which pulled down a large, they're in Norway, they pulled down a large EU grant to be able to fund this project. And that was the core. The upper left-hand partner here was the core partner, the starting place, right? But once we had that core funding in place, which is a research funding that I could work on the story underneath, we were then able to build all the rest of these collaborations. So I'll just highlight a few. Vox came on to do a short explainer series. GoPro and Sony provided some gear. Pulitzer funded my research partner, my writing partner to be able to go and do that Vox series. National Geographic published the photos. We had distributors, everything from different film festivals, again, Nat Geo, and all the way down to New Day Films, which now carries the film. Nonprofit organizations that have shared the content include the Climate Museum, the Arctic Institute. We've had educational organizations such as the Glasgow Science Center that now carry some of the content to teach around it. The International Maritime Organization used some of the images for an advocacy campaign that they ran. And then on the art side, Decade of Change Award that's run by the British Journal of Photography, took some of the photos, gave them an award, showed them around the world in galleries such as the Jockey Club in Hong Kong, Climate Week NYC. Okay, we could go in and dive in and talk about each one of these things, but the idea here is once you've got something good, you've got a great story, thinking about actors in these spaces that can do work that you can't, and building relationships with them directly to be able to do that. And all of these connections happen because I picked up the phone and called somebody. Right, so that's the critical bit. Don't be afraid to do that if you want to make your project bigger, better, and higher impact. Okay, and last, I want to talk a little bit about distribution. You know, you can have the best possible story in the world, the best photos in the world, but they're only as good as your ability to get them out there. As we all know, right? Publication is essential. So how do we do that? Well, I just want to give you 4 options here. And a lot of people will skip right down to number 4 and think, okay, I've got to learn how to pitch directly to outlets like the New York Times, Washington Post, Nat Geo, and so on. And it's true, pitching to outlets is a big part of this work. And certainly as time goes on, you build more contacts, your work gets better, you're going to be in a better position to do that. But I want to tell you, it's really, really, really hard to do. And a lot of times in your first several years, you may not get even a return email. And even then down the road, just because you know people and you published there before, doesn't mean that you're going to get there again. So what I would suggest, and what I often suggest to my students, is we think about doing the top 3 first, or even in conjunction with the bottom one. So let's just say a word here. First, there's open platforms like Instagram, Lens Culture, Social Documentary Network. You can put your work out there, have it be seen in a public space, and it can still get picked up by outlets. That's changed these days. It used to be once your work was seen publicly, no one else would touch it. Nowadays, you can put it out there. Maybe an editor at one of these magazines will see it and they'll pick it up. So feel free to do that. Second, you can bring your work to photo shows and competitions. And I put here in bold that outlets like Photo Contest Insider or Cafe are really great places to learn about the photo shows that you might want to apply to. And here's a list of some that you could apply to. And the goal there is to really apply to one where you're a good fit. You know, these are highly, highly competitive and folks all over the world. But if you've got great photos and you match the prompt, you know, what they want to show, and you're the right person, you've got the right why, you never know. You may be able to slide in there and be able to get that award, and that award could lead to a publication. And in fact, I just sat on a jury for an award recently, and those are the main questions we're asking ourselves. Is this person in this project really the right fit, and do they have the right photos? Okay, and then finally, you can go to portfolio reviews. And if you're not already aware of these are a really, really great way to sit down with an editor one-on-one and get your work seen. And I've had so many stories, both for myself as well as other photographers, that these experiences directly led to publishing a piece of work that opened up more doors to more publications down the road. So here are some really great ones to think about. Actually, I don't know if the Times runs theirs anymore. This could be a dated slide, but Center Santa Fe has got a great one. Griffin Museum, Exposure Palm Springs is a really good one. Photo Plus and Photo Lucida are all really great spaces. And now Social Documentary Network also has one as well. So think about doing a portfolio review. It is a pay-to-play space, but it can be well worth the time that you put in. Okay, great. And that's the end of my presentation. I've left some time here at the end to be able to take some stories. I'm sorry, take some questions. But I want to say again, before jumping off, thanks so much for being here. I'm really excited to take your questions and see you back next week. We're going to be diving into some of the gear and some of the tips that allows you to be able to do this work. Again, you can follow me. I'm Michael Snyder, and you can follow me at Michael O. Snyder at Instagram. And I encourage you to check out Outex, whose gear we're going to be looking at next week. And you can follow them at Real Outex or outex.com.